Hello and welcome to the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. This is your Communist Radio Hour, and my name is Uriah Mark Todoroff, aka The Inverted Form. In today's episode, we have something a bit different for you, something very special, a conversation that I had with Mr. Jasper Bernes on his follow-up to the essay that Owen and I covered from a few weeks back on logistics. This time we are talking about agriculture and thinking about sustainability in a revolutionary context and how we need to, restructure the world. And we also talk a lot about Marx's concept of the metabolic rift that kind of grounds the entire conversation. I thought it was a great conversation, had a good time, very fruitful, and I learned a lot. And hopefully, you're able to get something from it as well. Hopefully, you like the conversation. Hopefully, I have more of this to come. And if you do like the conversation, if you don't like the conversation, please feel free to sound off in the comments. Thank you, Jasper, for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'm just going to we're going to be talking, I guess, mostly about your essay, "The Belly of the Revolution." It's called, about like agriculture and food production and distribution. It really like takes up a lot of the themes and concepts that you're working with in the essay we read from Endnotes Volume 3 on logistics, but specifically kind of focusing on the question of like agriculture and like talking about technology in a more kind of general sense. Logistics is still relevant, but to me it felt like you're going a bit more general with it. It was like a bit more dense of a read. There's a lot more going on. It was more kind of difficult for me. So I have just like a lot of questions coming out of it. But the first question that I want to ask you here, it's kind of about the methodological approach of the systemic dialectic, which was kind of important for Endnotes in volume 2. They had like whole essay where they're just specifically talking about it. It's kind of this like framework for looking at totalities or like more complex systems and isolating various aspects of these systems that are kind of like working synchronously. So it seems kind of relevant to a topic like logistics because obviously there's so much going on and time is an important factor of it. So I just wonder if that like approach, if that theory has like influenced you at all, if it was relevant for you.
Yeah. The theory has, both in the specific sense and a kind of more general sense. I think that the term systematic dialectic comes from Chris Arthur, and who we might say is kind of one of many people working in the area of value form theory. And what I think Chris Arthur and the other people working on the area share is this approach of looking at the relationships between the different parts of the capitalist mode of production and seeing how they are logically and structurally connected rather than just simply connected. And that's to say that the relationships between different areas or spheres or parts of the economy are logical relations. And if they're logical relations, that means that they presuppose each other sometimes. And so this notion of presupposition, which is a kind of a Hegelian word, is really, really important for Chris Arthur, and I think for this entire approach. And I can give you an example by just thinking about like the state and the way that different Marxists have approached the state. Like one way to think about the state is that it's like an instrument and it's like an axe, you can use to chop wood, and like whoever holds the axe is gonna like make the state what it is, right? So that's an instrumental approach. So the connection between the state and the capitalist class is just simple. It's like a connection between an axe and a hand, right? That's one way of looking at the state. But another way would say, if you have a capitalist system and you want to have capital and production for profit in the market, then you have to have all these other things, and you have to have there are presuppositions,
Right.
legal presuppositions of the capitalist form that are going to require a state to do different kinds of things. And that's going to determine what kind of state you have. In particular, Chris Arthur, who wrote this book, and I think the title of it is called like, The New Dialectic and the Spirit of Capitalism or something. I forget the title of the book, but it's basically where he develops his theory. And parts of the theory I'm not so sure about. Sometimes people call it like idealist, like it's too Hegelian, like it kind of makes capital into like a subjective history. And I'm not so sure about that. However, there's a chapter in that book that is incredibly important to me. It's called Epitaph for the USSR, A Clock Without a Spring. And I believe I mentioned it in this article. And, you know, unlike a lot of people working in this area, that article is one of the few to actually talk about technology at the level of technique and materiality, and how it's related to the value form and the kind of formal aspects of capitalism. And he talks about how the factory system in the USSR was essentially form determined by the requirements of capitalist production for profit. So the factory system in the Soviet Union and the USSR was essentially trying to model the sort of capitalist mode of production with its dynamism and its kind of inherent tendency towards accumulation and growth. It only modeled the mechanism, but it didn't have a spring. It didn't have the market form production for profit to really drive it. So it's sort of like the Soviets took the thing which had been form determined by capitalism and tried to reproduce that, but it didn't work because they didn't have the spring. And so that relationship, that thinking about, you know, clock, spring, and form determination, and the way that the like kind of the necessary physics of the value system is going to give you a factory that is a particular collection of mechanisms and that you can only do certain things with. That's a really different way of looking at, you know, the relationship between technology and, you know, the productive forces and capitalism. And so I really take that way of looking at things and do a lot with it. And he's one of the, you know, many, there's several people who develop this kind of, this Marxist theory of technology that I'm trying to clarify and extend. And he's, you know, that article is definitely part of the constellation of really important pieces of work.
I'd imagine that this, going to your Soviet example, this lack of a market as the spring, as like the driving force of this, you know, factory model, would maybe be their argument for why, you know, like reproducing this capitalist model was like a valid thing to do in a socialist context.
Right, and that's where, and that is a justification, and that was a justification, even though, you know, I mean, it needs to be said that Lenin, you know, as early as I think it was it 1921, you know, thought that they were transitioning to state capitalism, even though I don't think it was actually capitalism. I think that there was, you know, there was an awareness that there were major compromises, and no one was saying, you know, this is socialism or this is communism. They're all aware that there were problems in realizing the kind of, you know, world that they wanted to realize. But yes, I think that this is where value theory matters, right? If your ideas of what makes capitalism and what are presupposed by a certain part of capitalism, this really matters because it's going to determine what you can or can't do with these elements. And so, yeah, if you say, you know, it's capitalism is the market, and all we need to do is take away market distribution and do direct distribution, then you've abolished capitalism. And if you say socialism is, you know, redistribution, then you've achieved socialism by only doing a kind of partial abolition, right? And so then this is where, you know, the theory of what capitalism is matters. It only matters when it's put in the hands of people who can actually abolish things, but it, you know, it does potentially matter what you think capitalism is.
Yeah, this idea of like a partial abolition of capitalism is pretty interesting. You know, China, I believe that they're saying that like by 2050 they will, you know, do socialism, and they're still like going through the process of like moving through capitalism. Like that was kind of like the Maoist justification from way on, that they, you know, had to build up industry. And I guess, you know, some people are within the Chinese Communist Party are still, you know, using that kind of logic. They're still telling themselves that, and, you know, by 2050 they will, you know, abolish the value form.
right, by raising the productive forces to a certain level, where communism becomes possible. And you see how that idea of communism is, it is really purely distributionist, right? Communism is just something that like is just a different system of distribution, which is only made possible when this underlying development takes place. And the development itself is neither capitalist nor communist. It's just history, right? It's just, we're just becoming better and better at making things. And then eventually we won't need this terrible mangle of distribution, which is capitalism, right? And it'll kind of fall away like a carapace, right? And there are indications of this kind of view of the way capitalism works in Marx. You can hear it in the Communist Manifesto. There are passages at the end of volume 3 where he sort of sees things developing in this way, like the joint stock companies, like almost the birth of capitalism, communism within capitalism, and it's gonna, eventually just make it so that that corporations can't be run in any other way other than communism, because it's just the natural way to do this kind of corporate form. And so, that's an idea within communism that you can find elements of in Marx, and certainly I think Engels really took that and ran with it, and it's dominant. It is the orthodox view within Bolshevism, and certainly in Lenin, but also in Maoism. They all took this idea that the fundamental task was kind of development of the productive forces to the point in which they rupture with the mode of distribution, which is capitalism. And if that's your view, then I guess China's doing pretty good job. And the question of what China is a very complicated one and very interesting. I think that the question of, is China capitalist is very different from the question of, is the USSR capitalist, because they're just incredibly different systems the way that they function. I mean, there really is a market in China now, a quite thriving one, even though the state is deeply involved in the distribution of capital. It's it's very different than the way that things were organized in the USSR, or than they were organized, obviously, before the 80s in China.
Yeah, I'm just going off of Endnotes' own historiography here in volume 2. I think they say that value form theory only really emerged like relatively late, like mid to late second half of the 20th century, when there was like a translation of this like one Marx text that hadn't been translated before. Was it the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts?
Yeah, that's really important, but I'm not sure if that's the signal text for value form theory or not. I don't know the German writing that is like at the root of all of this, as well as the writer of that essay, for example.
They seem to be saying that value form theory emerged pretty late in the game, just because of like questions of like text and like philology, basically. But it's interesting to think, like just as a hypothetical, if China or even Russia, if they wouldn't have pursued the route of industrialization that they did, if they had these manuscripts, if they would have just like, instead of focusing on building the productive forces, they would have focused on abolishing the value form, and not necessarily have spent so much or just like built their entire framework around industrializing.
I don't know if the presence or absence of a manuscript could be that determinative. I would tend to believe that the source of these kinds of different ideas can't be really found in the world of ideas. That the origin of this is in the workers' movement itself, and in kind of ideas that the workers' movement had. And you can't say, there's a narrative of betrayal, which Endnotes critique. This idea that it's like the workers were themselves kind of pure and good, and it's just these bad intellectuals with these bad ideas that came along and kind of misled them. And I think that that's a story that it's nice to tell ourselves, but I don't really know that we can we can really put it down to good or bad ideas. I think that for better alert, the idea of raising the productive forces in order to get to communism, and we're going to do it now and then eventually get it later, that was convincing to a big part of the workers' movement and many workers, right?
Yeah.
And you see how it made sense in 1930 or something like that. That actually seems like, I'm not even sure in some instances if that's an impossible road. There's a very interesting text by this Council Communist group, and they have a sort of a version of how you do that. And I've read it critically. And, as I read it critically, I do think like, well, maybe if you had a revolution in this time, in this place, you could actually do this. I'm not sure, maybe that, maybe you could just do this kind of, accelerated productive force raising to like just make everything kind of abundant and just sort of break the shackle of scarcity or something like that. Maybe that was a kind of, path.
Yeah, so this question of technology and the role of technology in doing a revolution, it gets into my next question here, which is about the metabolic rift.
Yeah.
As far as like Marxist concepts go, it's a pretty deep cut. Like I confess that I'm not like super familiar with it, and probably a lot of people out there are not as well. So maybe you could kind of just like give us a bit of like a gloss on what the metabolic is, and maybe give us a bit of like a historical, theoretical, Marxist kind of context for it.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and it really is very deep. There's a lot of history of science and intellectual history around the concept of metabolism in the 19th century, which is like a thing that chemists and biologists were discovering. I believe that the term that Marx often uses for it is Stoffwechsel, but there's another kind of related term, and he was really interested in science, and he was interested in these discoveries that there were these essentially kind of metabolic processes of self-regulation, that animals and ecosystems and bodies were undergoing, and so he kind of uses metabolism as a way to, and uses that term as a way to think about the interchange between humans and nature. And I think that that's a bit misleading to say humans and nature, because once you start to talk about metabolism and you say that humans are joined to nature by metabolism through the kind of material processes, material resources that we take into our bodies and form our bodies with. That's Marx's conception. It's like that we form nature and we form ourselves because we are nature. Once you start talking about metabolism, then you are already actually sort of undoing the distinction between humans and nature, right? Because your metabolism indicates that we are continuous with nature. Our bodies are formed from those kinds of material resources. So metabolism is for Marx, the kind of cycle of plant and biological matters being built up into bodies and cities and structures according to human social relations. And Marx was interested in physics and biology and mathematics and chemistry and trying to understand these things. So he uses metabolism as a general concept, but then he talks about a rift in a couple of places. In the 19th century, there was a continuous kind of crisis of soil fertility. And as there have been, soil fertility is a huge problem and basically connected to agricultural productivity. And soil science was in a germinal state then. There were a lot of things that they didn't understand about these ecosystems and about soil. It's a very complex science. And they essentially just had, discovered essentially the kind of nitrogen processes that essentially make soil fertile. And then they were kind of, trying to get these mineral and artificial sources of phosphorus and nitrogen to enrich depleted European soils. They were also just kind of going in, a lot of the high agricultural production in the 19th century had from taking essentially virgin soil, cutting the forest, and then doing intensive farming for 30 years until the land was stripped. And that's most of the American West, and the Midwest was essentially farmed that way. But then you get these massive kinds of collapses because you've done this intensive farming. And so there was these ongoing problems of soil fertility, and many people, including Marx, thought that this was like, along with the falling rate of profit and all these other big scary things, was a kind of a crisis that was going to affect humanity, and that the soil was going to become infertile. And he understood this as an interruption, a rift in the process of metabolism, because basically he understood that as people begin living in cities and begin living further and further from the places where their food is produced, you interrupt this metabolic cycle in which kind of food products become waste products and then get returned as waste to the land. Instead, the waste is no longer getting returned to the land. It's sitting in sewers and in cities. And along with all the kind of poisonous products of industry, you have to understand that cities in the 19th century were just filled with shit, right? There were these really there were places that everybody experienced as deeply filthy and unsanitary. And that unsanitariness was because of the metabolic rift. It was not only depleting the soil, it was making cities shitty, right? And so it was very easy for Marx to say, oh, this is the problem. You need to restore the cycle. You need to restore this process of metabolism and then return wastes to the soil. And so, it connected to this vision that Marx had and that, he shared with, I think, the majority of 19th century socialists and communists, which is that the revolution would be, among many other things, a kind of reconfiguration of the relationship between town and country, and would overcome this structure of society where certain people lived in the cities and other people lived in the country, and all the shit and waste and poison built up in the cities. And the country are these kinds of pure places where the food is good, but people have no access to kind of culture or technology or anything like that. That's an imbalance that needs to be overcome for a lot of reasons for the revolution to be successful, but for people to live the lives that they want to live. So that's the metabolic rift. But then when that idea is popularized by John Bellamy Foster, who is a person who's written a lot of really excellent work on Marx's ecology, he kind of almost takes it and turns it into this metaphysical thing. The rift is between humanity and nature, right? And though I think, certainly that's one way of thinking about what's happening in that division between town and country and, the problem of shit, it's kind of a metaphysical way of thinking of it. And as I said, it discounts what Marx already, it discounts the weirdness of the concept of metabolism. So he gets critiqued by that, by Jason Moore, and that's a debate about the meaning of that term that people can look at, and I sort of side with the idea that there's already a kind of monism in that concept, but that's not the interesting part of it for me. Like I'm saying, the interesting part of the metabolic rift is very specific. It's about this specific ecological cycle that has to do with nitrogen in the soil and the stripping of nitrogen from the soil, which is connected to the buildup of wastes in cities. Right. And Marx recognized that as a problem. And he was very interested in the work of Justus von Liebig, who was beginning to kind of map out the nitrogen cycle.
When you're talking about this kind of metabolism between man or humanity and nature, and how technology is a part of nature as well, it just for some reason brought me back to Paradise Lost, that poem by John Milton, and there are parts of it where he's describing Adam and Eve's activity in the Garden of Eden, and the garden is described as this kind of wild forest. It's untamed, but their labor, it's not really labor in any traditional kind of sense, but it's like an activity that they pursue just in order to do something. But they garden it, so they're gardening it just not for any direct reason or anything. They're able to just eat from the trees or whatever. But it's kind of a interesting way to think about the relationship between man and nature, and technology, gardening as a kind of technology is it's applied to nature, but it's still kind of part of it.
I actually think that's incredibly apropos, and there's a whole it opens up a whole web of really fascinating associations for me. I love Milton, and Paradise Lost is a book that I really love. And I mean, most people don't like Milton. They think he's boring or something. I think it's
so wrong.
Thrilling, some of the most thrilling writing ever produced. Absolutely. And a vision of communism in those sections, and absolutely, I love Milton. And but what's interesting about the garden as a kind of idea of the relationship between human and nature is it's kind of a moment before violence, and before blood sacrifice and kind of eating animals and stuff. But also, more importantly, it's a relationship to nature that's based on kind of tending, right, and cultivation, and orchards, rather than plowing the soil and ripping it up, right? And And, it's like the garden is the place where you pull the apples off the tree, and taking the apple from the tree doesn't hurt the tree, right? And so it's this like kind of different relationship where it's kind of like the earth just gives up its fruits naturally. Like the earth is doing the work for you. That's the vision, right? In an orchard, the earth is doing a lot of the work for you, and you don't have to toil. And and that's actually kind of how people live, right? It's only with the emergence of emergence of kind of grain that agriculture becomes toil. So, and in fact, the Marx and his colleagues really recognize this. In the orchard, there's a passage where Engels talks about how in communism everybody will just tend to orchards because it's this kind of, it's a form of agricultural work that is pleasant. Yeah, so I think there's something to this idea of a relationship between humans and nature that is more along the lines of an orchard or a food forest than a plain where you rip up the soil with big machines and then sow seeds in and then rip them up again.
Getting back to like the more kind of materialist, kind of like technical side of it, Marx is writing about how, as you're saying, like the development of cities and the concentration of city-based populations led to this kind of like a soil-based collapse. Like the agriculture that they're doing back then was not sustainable. I mean, it's not sustainable today either,
Absolutely.
but yeah, so this is like very like a technical kind of aspect to how he understands this concept of the metabolic rift, even though we can think of it in more like kind of grandiose ontological terms about the division between man and nature. There's also like a very concrete side of it where we're really just talking about the soil and how like the actual way that our capitalist civilization is structured is fundamentally unsustainable.
Absolutely. And yeah, and just to like underscore that materialist kind of connection that I maybe didn't point out, the difference between the orchard and the wheat farm is that when you're tearing up the soil, you're stripping the soil. It allows the resources to be stripped from the soil, but that doesn't happen in that other kind of thing because you're not tearing the soil. So carbon is trapped within the soil, and that's a way that a lot of nitrogenation. Those soils are very rich. They're full of nitrogen and other resources, and carbon's trapped in it. All of that is stuff we want to do. And I'm certain that agriculture has to move in that direction for many, many reasons. Among them is that it's carbon intensive, unlike plowing and stripping. So, which is not to say that won't have a role. It's hard to imagine that going away completely, but there needs to be a lot more of keeping that lot more of this orchard, which is actually makes it impossible for you to deplete the soil, but also makes it impossible for you to release all the carbon trapped in it. So it's good in 4 or 5 different ways.
Right. So your view is that agriculture needs to move towards something more like a permaculture, where it's kind of like a self-contained system, and the role of the agriculturalist, the farmer or whatever, is to tend it. It's like kind of like self-sustaining. It's a bunch of plants that are like interacting with each other and feeding off each other in a kind of like a in an ecological way. And the role
Yes,
of the farmer is to come in and take the fruits that are already ripe, not to strip it in any kind of way.
I absolutely believe that, and and I think that that's like almost kind of a consensus that's emerging. It's just
Yeah.
so obvious. Of course, permaculture, is something that wasn't designed to be communist. It was kind of designed to be something that individuals and households could do. So it's a real work to kind of take this science and adapt it to the needs of communism, and it will probably be changed. Like I said, I'm pretty agnostic. To me, it's not a question of like, do you never do grain farming in valleys with machines. Maybe you do some of that. I'm not, it's just a question of what do we need to do to allow everybody to flourish,
Right.
and to decarbonize and make communism, and a lot of the ideas for permaculture are going to be essential for that. And the things that people are trying to do, people are, permaculture is like active area of research, the ways in which people are trying to push it right now are going to be helpful, and communists need to be, talking to people who are trying to make, chestnuts into a staple food and things like that.
Right. Yeah, that kind of immediately came to mind, like when we're talking about permaculture, and then like the question of grain. Like, as I don't actually know too much about this, but my understanding is that grain like takes a lot of space in order to cultivate, and permaculture, it's kind of like it's kind of difficult. I mean, I don't know if it's ever been done kind of like at scale in quotes, like to sustain large populations more than just like a smaller community or a household. But it's kind of like, I don't know, do you know anything about the possibility of like producing grain in a permacultural context?
I think that they try not to do things like, I mean, it's more like grasses and things like that, or
Okay.
they kind of want to like, I think they try to like do perennials, not perennials, I get it confused, but they want, their stuff to be, you don't have to kill the plant to harvest it for the most part, I think.
Okay.
And the idea is the idea is that you can potentially do all your staples that way. That it would be, instead of your staple being wheat, it would be an acorn or something like that. But then I think there's ways to do grasses where you just harvest the grass instead of cutting it. I don't know that. I mean, because the grains all came from that originally, right?
Right.
I have friends who are like more tell me all stuff. It's a good question.
Yeah.
But I think we do need to really imagine what it would mean to do it collectivist, and that's like going to be a completely different thing. What you can do with thousands of people is different.
Yeah.
I sort of always imagine that it might look something like this. Like there's a lot of food production gets decentralized and localized, but maybe that isn't adequate to meet everybody's needs. And there's still some somewhat centralized like valley food growing, perhaps of grains or whatnot in certain areas. And people are kind of rotating to do that. It's not hard to go spend the summer. I mean, because that's the thing about, that's the thing about the labor relationship is that it's seasonal. That's one of the problems for capitalism, right? Is like you need people to do this work, but you don't need them all year. And so, we may have to kind of have these rhythms where it's like you're living in one place, but then in the summer you go to another place to help with the harvest. Capitalism and the prior forms, to a certain extent, have made agriculture incredibly productive, have increased the productivity of agriculture, but chiefly the productivity of labor and not the productivity of land. So contemporary agriculture is very labor saving and not very land saving. But it means that we devote humanity devotes an incredibly small amount of time to just growing food. So you could triple it and it wouldn't be a problem, especially if you stop just making all this stupid junk, right?
Yeah.
But so permaculture is going to be more labor intensive, but less land intensive.
Right.
And so that's the trade-off. And so, I think that to me, just having looked at all the things you need to think about, there's no question to me that, if we're lucky enough to like make a communist revolution, which can decarbonize, and is the only way you could, all of us are going to have to spend more time. We're going to have to be more involved in our food, but also that's not particularly a big deal because, if everybody, we're spending, 5 to 10 hours across the food system, that's easy, and why not? It is the most important thing. So it's such a small part. It's like now it's like maybe we, each one of us, if you average it out, is doing like 10 minutes or 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, totally.
You can increase it by 10 and it still leaves you with plenty of time to lie around or whatever. So one of the things that what I'm saying is that we are going to have to be more labor. We're going to have to devote more activity and energy towards food, but we have it, we have it to give, and that won't be an issue.
Permaculture, it's really like, it's maybe kind of difficult to like set it up initially, like to set up like kind of a self-sustaining system like that. There's a lot of like technical knowledge, and again, like this is something that used to kind of just be natural. Like if you think about, the Garden of Eden, it wasn't, there's no like technical knowledge really involved in setting up a garden to sustain itself. But,
Right.
coming from monoculture, moving to permaculture, it involves some like technical knowledge and, like
Yeah,
some like initial labor to set it
totally.
up, and then it gets the ball rolling, and then you kind of you're harvesting it.
I think the technical project of doing all that stuff and everything that would go along with it, which is, redoing energy and water and all of these things, that's the like most exciting technical project of humanity. That's
Yeah,
way more interesting than the Manhattan Project. I mean, to
yeah,
me, and way more, and it's going to require, way more of the kind of greatest minds to work on it and realize that's what we need to be focusing on. It's not necessarily exclusive with, high technique in some way either.
right. Yeah. Also, on a more superficial level, I think it's kind of like known that, for humans, like getting your hands dirty, like putting your hands in dirt, is actually like really good for your mental health. So there's a lot of like
Yeah,
pleasure that comes along with that kind of activity. Um,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's just, and that, and and what I'm trying to point out is like, even though we think of Isaac Bebel as being like the most kind of boring exponent of, you know, um, gradual social democracy um, of the 19th century, he could recognize that, and he was like, all the workers will be very happy to live, in the countryside and tend to the orchards because it will be good for their limbs and their brain. I mean, that's a concept that's not, foreign to communism and socialism, and yet I think somehow it within in a lot of sectors it is.
this kind of gets us into the next question I have here. This question of the divide between town and country. It's an important question in Marx, just thinking about the metabolic rift. That's kind of like when he's talking about like this technical aspect of like soil degradation. You know, as you've explained it, like that comes about as a result of concentration or movement of vast populations from the countryside into the city, and like this kind of a shift in how we do agriculture and everything. But it's also important. It's been important in the great communist revolutions of the 20th century. In Russia and China is a big issue for them. How to both activate the people who lived in the countryside, or how to like connect their movement that originated in the city, talking about Lenin, or like mobilizing the proletariat, the urban proletariat, and then having this kind of like alienated or like strained relationship with the peasants of Russia, and then in China, Mao doing basically the exact reverse. But maybe you could talk a bit just about this divide between town and country, and like where it comes from and kind of like what it means.
The divide between town and country is a problem in several ways, and I think we've talked already about how it's a sort of ecological problem, or it's an obstacle to meeting the demands of climate change, and also just it leads to all these other problems. But the thing that I stress both in my article on logistics and then this, which is sort of a follow up to that, is that it's a problem if you want to make revolution and you want to make communism, which is that we have these kinds of world spanning global kind of supply chains that will almost certainly be interrupted by a process of revolution, even if the revolution is global. And as a matter of survival, revolutionaries are going to have to undo and break those kind of chains and reconfigure the kind of whole way that food and production is done as a matter of necessity, just to survive. Even if they don't care about ecology, even if it wasn't a climate change problem, this would still be a requirement. So that's really important, is that because I don't think revolutions are moral affairs. I don't think people make revolutions based on, something that they hope, they need to happen 30 years in the future. I don't think that the revolution will be made, for ecological reasons, or if it is, it'll be because those ecological things are already materially affecting people's lives immediately. So that's really important, right? That you're gonna have to do this whether you like it or not. And unless, and that's because if the revolution doesn't break through in every part of the world, then essentially production is going to be interrupted. And so that puts a place that wants to kind of make a revolution in this bind, where it's going to be essentially has to like be dependent upon trade with communist partners or not. And if that trade relation introduces kinds of dependency, it'll destabilize any attempt to kind of move towards communism. And we've seen how that happens. So as a matter to survive, as a like necessity of the revolution, you need to kind of break with those dependencies and produce a kind of, an immediate kind of communism of basic necessities, right? And be able to kind of meet within the revolutionary zone all, the major needs of the revolution.
Right. Yeah. To kind of give a bit more context for like why I think it's important to talk about this and why I'm asking you about this. Like in your logistics essay and in your agriculture essay, you're talking about like the systems, the kind of like technological systems that we've been thrown into here in terms of like global trade, and also in terms of like our food production, how we reproduce ourselves as like biological beings here. But those systems are unsustainable. You argue for that, and we all know that. We also have to like think about why they're unsustainable and like how we're going to overcome that. And overcoming that, like are like these systems are kind of like erected around this division between town and country, as like Marx was writing about this aspect of the soil degradation, as you've pointed out. That metabolic rifts comes about, I guess, through this like division of town and country. And in order to move to a more sustainable way of living, like a revolutionary communist society, we are going to have to figure out how to live in a way where we are not like segregated into towns or countrysides.
Yes, and I think you can arrive at that conclusion also simply by considering the definition of communism, right? Which is a situation in which the free development of each is dependent upon the free development of all, and that means that the division of labor in that society can't be a fixed and rigid structure limiting people's choices and possibilities. So to me, it's hard to imagine having a situation where some people live in the middle of nowhere growing food, and then other people live in this other place. I mean, unless people were simply indifferent to that choice, and I sort of have that. I find that hard to imagine. And so I think simply from the perspective of communism as free development and free association, you're going to have to imagine some overcoming of the division of labor that divides town and country, and that says, no, you're going to do farming and you're going to make things with metal, right? That's not like that division. And necessarily, I'm not saying everybody's going to do everything, but the division between town and country is not simply a division between kinds of things, but types of things, right? The work in the city is where you do intellectual work, and so I just I think that it connects to a division between manual and mental labor, and it connects to a division between the peasantry and the working class. There's all kinds of ways in which we can see that that's a kind of these are sets of categories that are going to need to be overcome by the revolution.
Right.
And there's lots of ways to do that. I mean, what does it mean to overcome the division between town and country? We've done it to a certain extent already, in which like you can with certain kinds of communication technologies that sort of does it. And so I just think there's a lot of different ways that these that this could be done. But all of it is sort of based on the idea of people being closer to their food and the other things they need to live.
This question of like town and country, like it's interesting to think about like what that means in the contemporary context, because as you have said in this conversation, modern agriculture has vastly reduced the necessary labor in order to produce like food. So there are not really that many people in terms of like pure population numbers who are living in the countryside. So like what is it that is still dividing town and country? It is still like, as you're saying, it's not just about and also as well, like what is a contemporary peasant? There are no peasants really in North America or like the high GDP countries, as Endnotes say. But so like what does it mean in the contemporary context? It has, as I think you're saying, it has to do with like our proximity to our food sources, and how I guess our cities are structured in themselves. And it's less about like a division between like population groups. It's more like a kind of stratification of our society and like the kind of technologies that we depend on.
I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about where those divisions lay. And there was an interesting conversation on Twitter with As a Worker, Sean from the Antifada
Right.
podcast the other day, who put up a graph that showed basically the increase in the number of farms and the decrease in the average and the decrease in the average size of the farms. And what that tells you is that it's a little bit more complicated than the story you were just telling, because although, I mean, there definitely are a lot less people in the countryside, that's for sure. Lots of people have migrated, but a lot of people still are in the countryside. It's just that they're not producing food. Whereas, it used to be that you needed to have 80% of all people living in the countryside and working on producing food to make sure everybody ate, right? That's no longer necessary because of capitalist kind of modernity and technology. But not everybody goes and does something else. Some people continue to produce food, but just marginally, right? So you have a lot of people who are, and this is what the peasantry is today, is, people inhabiting really marginally productive plots of land and having no resources and trying to kind of eke out an agricultural subsistence and then selling the rest. But the people who do that, and there are a lot of them, are not really contributing much to the overall output, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Because actually most of the output is being done by these big corporate producers or big family farms that have employees, right? And so there are a lot of people that still have farms, but they're not really doing much in terms of, except for themselves, right? So essentially, like, we can sort of get rid of that, and those people, those people could do something else or do other kinds of agricultural work, and so what I'm saying is that there still are a lot of people that, like, technically, I mean, depending on what your definition of peasant is, like, you may call those folks peasants, and it's more complicated. Some of them are doing other kinds of like informal work. They take on whatever work they can get. The story's like usually like they have a farm, they're growing some stuff, they eat some of it, they sell some of it. Everybody's taking odd jobs, right? That's what it looks like, and barely getting by, or doing collecting wire and selling it at the scrap metal heat dump. And so, and the countryside isn't, is full of weird industry and light industry and stuff like that. It's much more complicated, but there's just a lot of people who are, sort of technically connected to agriculture, but aren't contributing much because of the fact that it's done in this way that's about, profit, right? And about, it's just the whole agricultural system, if you look at it, is so inefficient and wasteful. I mean, the amount of food that gets wasted because of production for the market is insane, just insane.
Yeah, this question, what you're saying, it makes me think of like recently, I don't know, in the past decade or so, there's been this big boom in like urban mycology, urban mushroom production. I mean, maybe that's just in my sphere. I don't know if that's like
no,
really
I have some, but I have some experimental mycologists in my
yeah. So and then on top of that, in Montreal, we have this one company. I'm not going to name them, not for any particular reason, just because I don't want to. But there's this one company that they are doing like urban agriculture and trying to do it at scale. At least in their copy, they say that they are like the largest urban. They have the largest like urban agricultural sites in the world, and they have like 4 of these warehouses. Basically they go into like kind of like exurban suburban
Right.
areas, find like these like big ass like production facilities that's kind of like low to the ground,
Mhm.
that just like wide spread out buildings, and then they'll like build a greenhouse on top of it. And these are like hydroponic farms, right?
Yeah.
So they're able to like produce a lot of like, basic stuff, not like any kind of like substantial produce, but they're producing like greens and like maybe
Yeah.
cucumbers and that sort of thing. And then they reproduce like the Amazon model of distribution, where it's literally the exact same thing as Amazon, where it's reproducing the worst aspects of working for Amazon and working for conventional agriculture, because they hire like migrant laborers at a very low rate. They have an extremely high turnover, and they get these people to like go, and they're like tracked by like apps on their iPad. They have to like run around through these facilities, like packing like greens into boxes that get like delivered to your door or whatever. So it sounds great in a way. You're able to produce food within the city, and presumably at scale. Like they are only using like a few buildings, but like what if they rebuild like farms on the roofs of a bunch of buildings? Maybe a city would be able to sustain itself. Unlikely,
Mhm.
but yeah, it's just interesting to think about. Like that is really not solving any problem. It seems like that is still like kind of fundamentally adhering to this kind of like metabolic rift that we are talking about, because we're like depending on technology in this kind of like unsustainable way, and labor as well. It just doesn't seem very
Right.
sustainable to me.
It does. No, it doesn't sound very sustainable to me either. And I mean, I would just, I would be interested in the energy content of any food produced by that. I
Yeah,
imagine that you're using a lot of electricity
yeah, exactly.
and energy resources in general to make that. And so it sounds cool.
Yeah, it does sound
But
cool.
when you think about, how, when you think about how, just as a matter of fact, just we need to reduce each person's average energy consumption by a factor of like 6 or something like that. It's That's not like, that's going to be one of the primary concerns, is doing food with very little energy. And so for that reason, I think that the urban thing will be somewhat limited, but I'm open to, I mean, I think like they may be figuring out something that will be useful for us. I mean, but obviously a lot of it isn't, but you know, um, cities are full of like buildings and useful spaces, and people will be living in them. My sense is that they'll probably become less dense, and in
Right.
doing that, in that way, that will become the overcoming of town and country. Like, maybe, you know, the density of Detroit is what inhabitation looks
Right.
like. I'm not saying every acre of land on the planet has the same density. In fact, I think that I've increasingly become uh, drawn to this somewhat simplistic idea of half Earth economics, um, which my friend Troy Battizi, who I mean I think his idea is somewhat different than mine, as he wrote a really great essay about this. And I think that it's clear to me that the only way to draw down sufficient carbon is to just let a lot of the planet go wild and be lightly inhabited, and that's the best technology we have.
Right.
And 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 we're going to need to do that. So so within overcoming town and country, I think there's also the need to kind of sort of let a lot of the planet rewild. And I think that that could be, you know, um, concomitant with a kind of like decolonial and kind of land back politics.
This idea of like are rewilding like certain sections of the planet. And this division between town and country, like I feel like you could kind of extrapolate it to a wider scale and say that, there's, and like use the same kind of framework for thinking about like different nations, like colonial nations and the colonized nations. There's some countries in the world that have been very brutally exploited by others in order for the primary country, like the UK
Yeah.
and United States, and what we're talking about. But these countries have exploited other countries in order to build up their own industrial forces, their own productive forces. And this question of like logistics and like the division between town and country and the metabolic rift and everything, it makes me like think about this aspect of it. Like, is there some kind of unfairness involved if we were to like I don't know, say that like we have to rewild parts of the planet, but then there are some countries that have not had the opportunity to like develop to the standards that we enjoy. Is there some kind of like asymmetry here? Is it like, how do we get around like perpetuating this kind of colonial like superiority of one nation over another, while doing a revolution in order to like overcome this metabolic rift, in order to overcome kind of like ecological contradictions of capitalism?
This is actually the only argument for like increase of productive forces that is like even close, even like a tiny bit salient, right? Which is the argument here is that like that the sort of things that we have and can do in the so-called developed world are sort of dependent upon this despoliation and destruction of these other places, um, and that despoliation and destruction is to be repaired, right? It's going to be harder to do communism in some of these places as a result of imperialism, right? And therefore, it's like a matter of justice, right? That like and that communists have like a that the revolution has an obligation, right, to engage in that work of repair, right? And that like because I believe that like everything belongs to everyone. If that's your definition of communism, that's mine. I mean, but like there, you can't let any imbalance like that really stand, right? And so, yeah, that's like but not, but the revolution isn't going to break through in every area, right? And so I think that there's just asymmetries are just, asymmetries are just going to be the name of the game, and until communism can win everywhere, and it's going to then look different everywhere, right? And so the process of then overcoming those asymmetries will be, it'll be a long process of work. And I absolutely think that it like my vision of communism is that like, communists in every part of the world will be concerned with the well-being of communists in every other part of the world, right? So that means that there's no task more urgent than to like repair those forms of imbalance, which aren't necessarily making everybody live the same everywhere. That's the other thing, right? It's about
Right.
a free possibility, and so I think there's just a lot of different ways that that can be worked out. Um,
Yeah, one proposal that I've heard that I think is like pretty convincing. It seems like to me like a pretty good solution to this problem is bringing in like reparations, and saying that's like say that we achieve a communism here in Canada or in the United States, um, and then like you have kind of like a socialist, or I don't know, let's just say that we have socialist nations presently in South America and in just in the global south, kind of like we have some socialist nations that have been brutally exploited by the United States particularly, and Canada as well. So like,
yeah,
if we achieve communism in Canada or in the United States, then we simply owe, as Canadians and Americans, we owe those socialist nations that we have exploited reparations, so we can, pay them in order to develop like sustainable technologies. We can like they shouldn't have to like suffer unequally. They shouldn't like have their potential, their potential for growth retarded as a result of like us, wanting to be ecological or something. So basically, we buy solar panels or whatever it is for these kind of colonized countries in order for them to be able to like get to a higher level of development while still staying true to our communist principles.
Right. I mean, there's a lot there's a lot there that like makes sense at the level of of principle. But I want to just like back up a second and
Yeah.
say that one part where I want to still put pressure on the productive forces idea is to assume that naturally, because a country or a zone is less industrialized, that means that it's going to be harder to do revolution there. My sense of technology and my sense of what a revolution looks like means that that's not necessarily true. A lot of it has to do with peculiarities of geography and landscape, and there's a lot going on. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that that it's easier in a fully highly industrialized country or harder in another. That's not true because of the way that we're part of this whole global system based on these global supply chains. You actually have to look at it at the level of the details. But there is some truth to it, right? At the same time, and I'm not denying that. So that's where I really connect with this idea at an ethical level. Well, what does it mean to pay reparations to a nation, right?
Yeah.
Can you really show me that actually is going to repair something at the level of people's lives? If you can show me that, then sure, I'm for it. My sense is that there's a lot in between the nation and people's lives, even if the nations are socialist. And that's not to say don't do it, but I just want to, I want to put pressure on the idea that reparations can be paid towards, to nations, especially where that means nation states.
I guess, I mean, like pretty related to this whole, basically what we've been talking about, especially like this relationship between different states, is the distinction between like planning and logistics, which, I mean, this seems like it may be a bit of a superficial question here, but like what is the distinction there? Like planning has been such an important part of like how the USSR developed, how China developed, and logistics is like a separate concept. It is not the same thing as planning, but it seems like they could be conflated in ways. And I guess in the context of like planning in a revolution, what we'd be planning for is degrowth. We'd be planning how to rewild different parts of the planet and planning out how we're going to be more sustainable, whereas logistics is about global trade, and it's like really particular to capitalism. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to talk about there, if there's any kind of distinction that you think is important between planning and logistics, and how we can think about planning in a kind of revolutionary context.
It's it's a very interesting question. It's interesting that you kind of opposed those two terms that way, and it was just helpful for me to see some obvious things that and obvious ways that I could phrase things. But the difference, I mean, the main difference between logistics and planning, where planning means what you were just talking about, like the planning of a revolution, trying to take care of the tasks of the revolution. And so logistics is not, it's not just that it has a different, more narrow set of objectives, it does, but it's also not total, right? Logistics is just what one company does, right? Logistics is a science of managing planning for companies, right? Not for a whole economy. So logistics tells one company how they can compete against another company and organize their own operations, right? But companies don't, companies only handle little segments of the economy. So what works inside of a company doesn't necessarily have any relationship to what works for an entire economy. And certainly the kind of questions that matter to us can't be settled within one company, right? So, or at least not most of the companies, right? I'm sure we can all settle a lot of our needs if we just open the doors of Walmart, at least for the first few hours.
Right.
But in most cases, it's too narrow of a segment to do much with, and so this idea that Walmart or Amazon or whatever big company we think somehow contains in its algorithms the seeds to kind of the planning of communism or socialism is totally ludicrous, right? Because they're doing this completely different thing, and and Walmart's algorithms and techniques, they presume production for profit, and they presume a market, and they presume competition. All of these things, which if you're a socialist, you want to get rid of. They presume maximum exploitation and a division of labor and a differential between different workers. That's the whole point of it, is to be able to go out and find the cheapest workers everywhere. That's what logistics is for. But if socialism means anything at all, then it has to be against that, right? In fact, it has to be against the whole idea of being, hired and fired at will, which is the basic core axiom of logistics. So there's a real contradiction there, and so so it's become popular to kind of make this connection, but it really is, as you see, based upon a really foundational misunderstanding. And that's not to say that maybe some of their computer techniques will be useful, but that's a very limited kind of usefulness.
Yeah, this might be a bit of an esoteric question, but I've heard people talk about the blockchain, that particular piece of technology, which is separate from cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are built on the blockchain, but the blockchain, has other applications. And some of the ways that I've heard people talk about it, it seems like that piece of technology, the blockchain, could be, I don't know, kind of interesting or like fruitful way to do a kind of like democratic, like transparent production and distribution, and it could have like a useful side to it that in a communist context. So I'm just curious if you've ever like thought about the blockchain, if you've ever like read about it, if you have any thoughts on that.
I've read a little bit about blockchain, and a lot of obviously kind of critical remarks on it, and skeptical remarks. Obviously, the way that the current technology, or some of the technology requires whatever proof of work, right? And I think all blockchain models that you require proof of work are like incredibly profligate with energy, right? Because the amount of work that they have to do, the requirements increase, like in Bitcoin, right? So that computers are having to output and do an incredible amount of work to generate the verifications, and that's using an insane amount of electricity. So that's obviously bad.
Yeah.
But my son, who is 16 and is the smartest person I know, also says similar things about blockchain. So I'm inclined to believe that because it's my son's thing. So he's also said similar things about how it can be used as like a voting protocol, and it's not necessarily, there's nothing, there are forms of blockchain that don't require proof of work, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I don't know an incredible amount about that.
Yeah, my personal intuition is that, I mean, this is just like my own kind of like analog kind of Luddite proclivity, but my feeling is that, we should not necessarily need to rely on these newfangled technologies in order to, learn how to be human, and that, this, like a kind of like computer technology, something that is, essentially digital, is not going to be something that we want to rely on forever.
However, I agree with that, and I think that a lot of the way we use digital technology is just so absurdly profligate. I mean, the amount of expensive and labor intensive like machinery and circuits that are near me and that are going to last for such a short amount of time, and that's absurd, right? And so, I mean, I would imagine a very different role for all of this, and I don't know what it is. But I do think the basic idea here, which is that like with blockchain, you have a voting protocol where no one person or group potentially like owns it or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
And so to the extent that some smart person can invent a like algorithm that does that and like really does that and is like really kind of foolproof, that sounds cool. You know, I mean, that sounds useful. You've convinced me already that that would be a thing that would be useful.
Just before we finish up here, I kind of want to talk about an essay that you published this year. I didn't read it. It's called Planning and Anarchy.
Yeah.
I read the abstract and it seems quite intriguing. And it seemed like, I don't know if this is like I'm sure this is the nature of abstracts, but it's a simplification of what actually occurs in the essay. But it seems like you're kind of arguing against this kind of like overcomplication on both ends of the political spectrum of, you know, questions of planning and logistics and, you know, how that would pan out in a communist context. So maybe we've already spoken about that. You know, it's more a question of scaling down technologies and rewilding as opposed to, you know, building up new systems and building up new technologies and whatnot. But maybe you could talk just a bit about what that essay is about and, you know, maybe how it relates to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it relates deeply, and everything you've been asking me about planning, I have, you know, tried to put into that essay. Although there's another essay that I want to write about planning, where I hope to deal with some of the remaining questions. But the thing I maybe didn't say is that, I mean, planning is a really big word, and it's kind of word that potentially can mean nothing, because every you know, collection of individuals and individual plans, right? We're all, as kind of humans, we're all sort of projecting ourselves into the future and our intentions into the future and following through on that, and sometimes in quite systematic ways that we call plans, right? Every, you know, group or corporation or state plans. But when Marxists talk about planning, they mean something much more specific, right? Which is the organization of like the main elements of economic life by a central body, or by some kind of automated system, right? And so, and I guess that what I would say is that that is a very particular response or a particular variety of planning, right? Of course, a revolution will need to plan. And need to undertake, you know, if there's a revolution in a zone involving millions of people, all of those people who, you know, want to live together in a communist way are going to need to plan. And in my view, one is going to need to do it in a way that like involves, you know, the largest possible number of people in that and in the decisions that matter to them, right? So it's you know, it's a massive undertaking, both in terms of participation and then in the technical things that need to be done. And of course, like, you know, what you don't need to plan, you shouldn't, or what you don't need to plan at the largest scale, you shouldn't. But sometimes there will be need to do things, you know, for people to come to coordinated agreements, you know, about how to say, you know, deal with an irrigation system that, you know, 100,000 people are going to use, right? Lots of people are going to have to be involved in that conversation. And it's going to matter, right? And it's not something you can just do tomorrow. And it's not something that you can do that the consequences of which aren't going to like affect everyone and future generations. So those are kinds of things that you need to plan around. But the central planning version of planning is just one way to do that, right? And it's sort of somehow Marxists, you know, have sort of thought it's the only way. And so they've become fixated on this kind of this problem called the socialist calculation problem, which is sort of only a problem if you assume that this is the only kind of planning. But you know, you know, this is like essentially a problem which the discipline of economics took up and was sort of trying to determine whether you know, a group of planners could make all of the necessary calculations to distribute goods just as well as the market does. And while that's an interesting question, it's not the question. And the answer to that question, yes or no, doesn't really have a lot of bearing on the success of the revolution, because the problem of organizing an economy isn't really a problem of calculation. The calculation problem is trying to calculate the amount of labor contained in every commodity. And that turns out to be a very difficult math problem if you have millions of commodities or even thousands. But that is actually not the real problem. The real problem is how you use that information to then get people to do the things that everybody needs everyone else to do, right? Which is a political problem. And just because you have the equation solved does not necessarily mean you have the motivation problem solved. And so the socialist calculation problem sort of assumes that you have these other mechanisms that are going to solve that motivation problem, and it essentially retains things like something like the wage, which compels people to work at a sort of average level of productivity, lest they be fired. And if you get rid of that, your plan is not going to be very useful, because you're sort of assuming that people are just going to do what you want them to do because you say so. But if you look at the history of attempts to organize things that way, they don't go very well. So planning turns out to be just kind of useless from that framework, because you've conceived it narrowly as a calculation problem, as a mathematical problem, not as a political problem. And so while the math solutions in the math may be very useful and necessary, and the algorithms may be helpful in certain things, it's a distraction from the real question, which is how do you organize people's lives in such a way that they're involved in the decisions that matter to them, and they can coordinate with others to live in a communist way. And that's a different planning problem. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our time here.
Okay, this was really fun, actually.
It's been great talking to you. Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually really, I felt really, this was helpful for me.
Yeah, it felt like a very fruitful conversation. Hopefully our listeners enjoyed it, learned a thing or two. Yeah. I know I did. So
yeah. I will not hide from this interview. I will actually tell people this.
It's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Reasonably coherent. So.
Yeah. All right. So so you wrote this essay, Planning and Anarchy. I mean, if you have a subscription to the South Atlantic Quarterly, the listener can go read that. But
it's possibly you can get it on my site.
Okay. Places. Yeah. So do you want to tell the listener where they can find you online, or like if you have anything to plug, anything coming down the pipeline that you want to talk about?
There's nothing that I can really think of right now. I'd just like to encourage listeners to sort of write about their experiences of struggle, and because I think I'm reading a lot of things. I'm trying to read as much as I can about the kind of uprising this summer, and just having accounts in writing of what people were doing and thinking, and is really helpful. And all of the writing I do is sort of either in either in dialogue with my own personal experience, or some kinds of first person accounts. Like I really think that theorizing happens in struggle, and I'm kind of reflecting things that I'm picking up that people are figuring out. So I would just like to encourage more, encourage more people to write about their experiences of struggle in a safe and anonymous way, because I think that it's to the benefit of all of us. And there's some sites out there that have been distributing, writing about, about struggles that I really appreciate. So I just, if you have an inkling to write something like that, please do. I encourage you to.
Yeah, that's a great plug. I'd definitely second that. Writing about your experiences struggling, that's a great plug. But but I guess you have a website. We'll put a link to that. We'll put a link to your Twitter.
Yeah, I have jasperbernes.net. So at jasperbernes.net, you can find all of my writings. I try to keep that up to date, and I have links to everything there. And yeah, some of these, and there's PDF versions of some of these free PDF versions around that can be found through just Googling the title.
Right.
And then I can be found on Twitter at, my handle is outside agitator. And maybe that'll get typed into the link. There's, outside and then ADGITATOR.
Right. Yeah. We'll put a link to that. And yeah, been great talking to you. I am Uriah Mark Todorov. You can find me on Twitter at The Inverted Form. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, Jasper, and
thank
bye.
you. Bye.